On February 16, 1862, Fort Donelson, Tennessee, witnessed a pivotal moment in the Civil War that would redefine the Union's strategy and introduce a commander who would change the course of the war. 3 points. Strategic rivers. Fort Donelson's fall opened the Cumberland and Tennessee Rivers to Union forces, turning them into vital supply and invasion routes deep into the Confederate heartland. Grant's emergence. The victory established Ulysses S. Grant as a commander who would fight aggressively and without asking for terms, embodying the relentlessness needed to win the war. Confederate collapse. The defeat exposed the weaknesses in Confederate command culture, leading to a collapse of their defensive lines in Kentucky and a retreat south, opening Tennessee to Union penetration. Join us in exploring this transformative battle that redefined the Civil War's Western theater. Discover how a man once deemed mediocre proved his worth on the battlefield and changed the fate of a nation. Click to learn more about Fort Donelson and the rise of Grant. February 16, 1862. Fort Donelson, Tennessee. 7 in the morning. The snow had stopped sometime in the night, but the cold had not. The temperature along the Cumberland River in the second week of February, 1862, was the kind of cold that settles into a man the way water settles into stone, slowly, comprehensively, finding every gap in the wool and the leather and the courage until the cold is not outside anymore, but inside, in the marrow, part of the body's interior landscape. 12,000 Confederate soldiers had been fighting in this cold for 3 days. They had attacked yesterday and nearly broken out of the siege that was tightening around their fort. They had fought through river bottom and frozen ridge and ravine with bayonets and muskets in temperatures that dropped below 20 degrees at night, had nearly punched a hole in the Union right that would have let them escape south. And then they had come back. They had abandoned the ground they had taken at such cost and come back inside the fort and surrendered the initiative and given the besieging force time to close the gap they had opened. Now, in the gray February morning, the Confederate commander sent a message under flag of truce across the frozen ground to the officer commanding the surrounding army. Brigadier General Simon Bolivar Buckner had served with that officer in the Mexican War. They had been friends in the old army, the army before the war, the army that had scattered its officers across 2 flags in the spring of 1861. When Buckner had been in financial difficulty in New York before the war, the officer he was now asking for terms had loaned him money without hesitation. The message was courteous. It asked what terms would be acceptable for the surrender of the garrison. The reply came back in minutes. It was not courteous. It was not friendly. It was the reply of a man who had been told his entire career that he was mediocre, who had resigned from the army in 1854 under a cloud, who had failed at farming and at real estate and at collecting debts, who had been working in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois when the war began, and who had spent the previous 3 months quietly, methodically, and without visible excitement building the operation that had just reduced 12,000 Confederate soldiers to surrender. The reply said, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. Ulysses S. Grant, Brigadier General, United States Army, 39 years old." The man the newspapers, seizing on his initials, would call Unconditional Surrender Grant before the day was out. The fort that he was accepting, 12,000 prisoners, 65 guns, horses, equipment, supplies, was the second major Confederate fort to fall in a week. Fort Henry on the Tennessee River had surrendered 10 days earlier on February 6th. Fort Donelson on the Cumberland had held longer and fought harder and cost more. But Fort Donelson had fallen too. Together, the 2 forts opened 2 rivers deep into the Confederate heartland. The Tennessee penetrated to northern Alabama. The Cumberland reached Nashville. Both rivers were now Union highways into the interior of the Confederacy, and the Confederate Army in Kentucky, the army that Albert Sidney Johnston, the most respected Confederate general in the West, had spent months positioning, had no choice but to abandon its forward positions and retreat south before it was cut off. This battle changed the Civil War forever, not because the Confederacy lost a single fort, but because it established, in the February of a war that was only 10 months old and already consuming lives in numbers that no one had planned for, the specific kind of Union commander that the war required. A man who did not ask what terms the enemy would accept. A man who moved immediately upon their works. The Western theater and the man no one wanted. The American Civil War in its first year was, in the Western theater, a war of rivers and railroads fought across terrain that the Eastern press largely ignored and that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. While the armies of the Potomac and Virginia maneuvered toward each other along the roads between Washington and Richmond, producing the battles that the newspapers and the politicians followed as the war's primary narrative, the Western theater was developing its own logic, its own geography, and its own commanders. The Western theater in early 1862 was the vast territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. The states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, and the portion of Missouri that was contested and violent and not quite Confederate and not quite Union. This territory was threaded with rivers, the Tennessee, the Cumberland, the Ohio, the Mississippi, that the antebellum railroad builders had bridged, and the military engineers now looked at differently as invasion corridors and supply lines, and the specific geography of a war that moved heavy equipment in quantities that roads could not handle. The strategic situation in the Western theater in the winter of 1861 to 62 was one that favored the Union in ways that had not yet been fully exploited. The Confederate defensive line in Kentucky ran roughly east-west across the state, anchored on the river forts that controlled the Tennessee and Cumberland corridors into the southern states. If those forts fell, the defensive line collapsed. The army behind it would have to retreat to avoid being cut off, and the retreat would open Tennessee and the approaches to the deep south to Union penetration. The Union commander in the West, Major General Henry Halleck, understood this. His subordinate commanders understood it. The Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston, commanding the opposing forces, understood it and was doing what he could with resources that were inadequate for the line he was trying to hold. What Halleck lacked, in the winter of 1861 to 62, was a subordinate commander willing to move with the kind of speed and decisiveness that the strategic opportunity required. He had Don Carlos Buell in Louisville, a careful, methodical general who organized well and moved slowly. He had a collection of subordinate commanders whose political connections and military credentials varied widely and whose mutual relationships were complicated by the politics of an army in which volunteer officers and West Point regulars coexisted in a structure of rank that satisfied neither. And he had, in Cairo, Illinois, commanding the district of southeast Missouri with the specific authority of a man who had been given a minor command because no one expected much from him, Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant's career to this point was the career of a man who had been good at some things and bad at others, and had not been in an environment that let him demonstrate which category mattered more. He was good at supply and logistics, having shown at West Point and in Mexico a mathematical facility for the mechanics of moving armies. He was good at reading terrain, at the quick operational assessment of what the ground offered and what it denied. He was good at making decisions under pressure, without communicating the pressure to the men around him, a quality that his subordinates noted and that his enemies, when they encountered it, found unnerving. He was bad at office politics, at the military courtesies that smoothed the relationships between officers of competing ambition, at the sustained self-promotion that a career in the antebellum army required from men who wanted to advance faster than seniority allowed. He drank, occasionally and sometimes problematically, though the extent and the impact of the drinking on his military performance was a question that his enemies used as a weapon and his supporters disputed with equal intensity. He had come back to the army in the summer of 1861 when the war began, had been given the colonelcy of an Illinois regiment, had organized it from chaos into something functional, and had been appointed brigadier general in August 1861 on the strength of a political connection to Illinois Congressman Elihu Washburn, who had enough influence with Lincoln to get Grant the star he would never have gotten on merit alone in the old army. The appointment was not controversial because Grant was not yet prominent enough to be controversial. He was simply one of many brigadier generals in the rapidly expanding Union Army, a man with a middling record and a minor command who had not yet done anything that required anyone to form a strong opinion about him. Henry Halleck, Grant's departmental commander, had formed a tentative negative opinion. Halleck was an organizational genius and a battlefield disaster. A man who would spend the war demonstrating that the skills required to build an army and the skills required to use one were not the same skills. He was methodical, politically careful, and deeply suspicious of subordinates who operated outside the precise boundaries of their assigned authority. Grant, in the weeks before Fort Donelson, had operated outside those boundaries repeatedly, had moved faster, committed forces more aggressively, and asked for forgiveness rather than permission in ways that irritated Halleck without producing results that could be blamed on Grant's initiative. Halleck had written to McClellan in Washington, suggesting that Grant might need to be replaced. Grant was not replaced. He was sent, with 17,000 men and Flag Officer Andrew Foote's river gunboat fleet, to take Fort Henry on the Tennessee River in early February 1862. Fort Henry fell before the infantry arrived. Foote's gunboats, mounting heavy naval guns that the fort's Confederate commander, Lloyd Tillman, could not match, reduced the fort's defenses in a gunboat engagement on February 6th, and Tillman surrendered to the fleet rather than wait for the army to arrive. Grant's forces were still marching through the flooded Tennessee lowlands when the flag went up. The victory was real, but incomplete. Most of the Fort Henry garrison had escaped overland to Fort Donelson, 12 miles away on the Cumberland. Grant wrote to Halleck that day, "I shall take and destroy Fort Donelson on the 8th. He was wrong about the date. He was right about everything else. The man commanding Fort Donelson when Grant's army arrived was not Lloyd Tillman. The Confederate command had shuffled its officers in the days between the two battles in the way that command structures shuffle when they are being asked to hold something they know they cannot hold. John B. Floyd was the nominal commander, a former governor of Virginia and former United States Secretary of War under Buchanan, a politician general whose military experience was thin and whose personal courage would prove thinner. Gideon Pillow was the second-ranking Confederate general, a Tennessee politician-soldier of similar credential, who had been a nuisance in the Mexican War as well. His personal vanity and his willingness to place his own reputation above the mission, producing the kind of command friction that professional soldiers find maddening, and that civilian generals never seem to understand is a problem. Simon Bolivar Buckner, the third-ranking Confederate general at the fort, was the professional soldier among them, a West Point graduate, a combat veteran of Mexico, a man who knew what the situation was and who would be left to deal with the consequences of the decisions his superiors made and then abandoned. Albert Sidney Johnston, the Confederate commander of the Western Theater, understood what the loss of the two river forts would mean for his entire strategic position. He understood it clearly and completely, and had been arguing for more men and more resources since his appointment to the command, had been telling Richmond that the line he was being asked to hold was too long for the forces available to hold it, had been explaining that Fort Donelson and Fort Henry were the keys to the entire Kentucky defensive position, and that their loss would require the abandonment of everything north of the Tennessee River Valley. Richmond had listened politely and sent him insufficient reinforcements and told him to hold the line. Johnston had done what commanders do when they are asked to hold the unholdable. He had made the best dispositions available to him and waited for the crisis that was coming. When Fort Henry fell and Grant turned toward Donelson, Johnston made the decision that the subsequent analysis of the campaign has almost universally condemned as a mistake. He reinforced the fort, sending additional troops to a position he already believed was indefensible, on the theory that a successful defense would justify the risk and a failure would at least demonstrate to Richmond the nature of the military situation. He reinforced Donelson with 12,000 men and sent Floyd to command them, and then he organized the retreat of his main army from Bowling Green toward Nashville and the south, leaving the Fort Donelson garrison to its fate. Floyd was the wrong choice for the command. Every professional soldier who dealt with Floyd during the Fort Donelson campaign noted the same quality in him. He was brave enough as an individual and useless as a commander, a man who could stand under fire but could not make decisions when the decisions mattered. His appointment was the product of the Confederate system's specific weakness in the early years of the war, the reliance on political generals whose state connections and public prominence mattered more to the Confederate political leadership than their military competence. In the Union Army, the command structure was simpler. Grant commanded. His subordinate commanders, John McClernand on the right, C.F. Smith on the left, Lew Wallace in reserve, were a mixture of political generals and West Point professionals, operating under a commander who trusted C.F. Smith most of all, because Smith had been Grant's instructor at West Point, and because Smith's military judgment was sound in the specific way that 40 years of soldiering produces sound judgment. Not theoretical, not doctrine-based, but the accumulated practical knowledge of a man who has seen a great many military situations and who has learned to distinguish the ones that require patience from the ones that require speed. McClernand was a problem of a different kind. He was a political general in the specific sense that the term implies, a man whose commission derived from his political connections rather than his military competence, who was genuinely brave in the physical sense, but who understood warfare in the parliamentary sense, as a competition between individuals for credit and recognition. His relationship with Grant was never easy. His relationship with Lincoln was close enough that Grant had to manage him carefully throughout the Western campaigns, never quite able to dismiss him and never quite able to trust him, walking the specific tightrope that political generals in the Union Army required their superior officers to walk. Wallace would write Ben-Hur 20 years later and be remembered more for the novel than for the battle where he served. The battle's outcome would be determined not by the commanders at the top, but by the single quality that Grant possessed and Floyd and Pillow did not: the willingness to act decisively in the moment when the battle's outcome was still in doubt, and every other response was to wait and assess. The ground, the guns, and the cold. Fort Donelson sat on a bluff above the Cumberland River, approximately 12 miles east of Fort Henry, positioned on the west bank of the river, where the bluff was high enough to command the river approach, and the surrounding terrain was broken enough, cut by ravines and creek bottoms and the ridgelines of the Tennessee highlands, to give a defending force natural obstacles to work with. The fort itself was modest by the standards of the formal fortifications that military engineers had built in the antebellum period. It was an earthwork fort, a series of rifle pits and gun emplacements, and trenches connected by communication lines and protected on the riverside by the bluff that gave its guns commanding elevation over any vessel attempting to pass. The Confederate engineers had extended the outer perimeter considerably in the weeks before Grant's arrival, building a system of trenches that covered the ridges and ravines surrounding the fort, and that required a besieging force to take them by assault, rather than by simply surrounding the fort and waiting for the garrison to starve. The terrain between the outer Confederate defensive lines and the Union forces assembling to the west and south was terrain that offered every advantage to the defender and every difficulty to the attacker. The ridges ran generally north to south, cut by east-west ravines that were steep enough to break any formation attempting to cross them under fire. The trees were bare in February, offering no concealment, but providing the specific visual confusion of a winter woodland. Irregular, full of shadows, the distances between opposing formations difficult to judge, and the movements of opposing units difficult to track from any single position. The ground was frozen where it had not been churned by the passage of men and animals, and where it had been churned, it was mud that had refrozen into ridges and holes that turned every movement into a negotiation with the ground. The river side of the fort's position was defended by the water battery, the heavy guns that commanded the Cumberland, and by the bluff itself. The Confederate engineers had positioned 2 heavy naval guns and a dozen lighter pieces in the water battery, aimed downstream at the approach angle that any Union gunboat fleet would have to use. These guns had already beaten off a Union naval probe on February 14th, damaging 4 of Foote's gunboats, including the flagship, and putting Foote himself out of action with a wound to his foot. The water battery's effectiveness was the specific fact that made Fort Donelson different from Fort Henry. The gunboats could not reduce this fort from the river, and the army would have to take it the hard way. Grant had approximately 17,000 men when he completed his investment of the fort. The Confederate garrison, swollen by the troops that had escaped from Fort Henry and additional forces sent by Johnston in a last attempt to hold the position, numbered approximately 12,000. This was not the numerical asymmetry that the popular histories of the battle sometimes suggest. 17,000 against 12,000 on broken defensive terrain was a ratio that any competent Confederate commander could have used to hold the position indefinitely or extract the garrison intact. The terrain favored the defense. The river protected the eastern flank. The Confederate artillery, well positioned and well supplied with ammunition, could make the approaches enormously costly. What the Confederate position lacked was a commander willing to hold it. The night before the battle's decisive action, the night of February 14th, after the gunboat repulse and before the Confederate breakout attempt, was a night of the specific February cold that had been the siege's third adversary alongside the Confederates and the Cumberland mud. The temperature dropped to perhaps 12 degrees. The Union soldiers who had been fighting and marching for 3 days had stripped off their blankets and overcoats at the start of the battle, in the conventional wisdom of soldiers who expected to be warm enough from exertion and who had not planned for February nights in Tennessee. Now they had nothing. The Confederate soldiers inside the fort were equally cold, equally exhausted, and in the possession of one additional piece of knowledge that the Union soldiers outside the perimeter did not have. Their commanders, meeting through the night of February 14th, had decided to attempt a breakout. The plan was to attack the Union right, McClernand's division, with the bulk of the Confederate force, punch a hole in the besieging line, and escape south along the Ford Road toward Nashville before Grant could close the gap. It was a sound plan, properly executed. It was the only plan available. The Confederate soldiers who were going to execute it spent the night preparing in the cold, loading cartridge boxes, checking percussion caps, packing what could be carried and leaving what could not, saying the prayers that men say before the specific kind of fighting that everyone in the formation understands will be close and brutal. They were not confident. Confidence requires a specific relationship between what you are about to do and what you believe the outcome will be. And the outcome these men were about to attempt was uncertain enough that confidence was not the right word. They were determined. There is a difference, and soldiers feel it. The Confederate soldiers at Fort Donelson in February 1862 were soldiers of a Confederacy that was 10 months old and that had won its only large-scale battle, Bull Run, through a combination of fighting quality, better ground, and Union command failure. They believed in their cause with the specific earnestness of men who had chosen a side in a conflict where choosing a side required something, who had enlisted, who had left families and farms and businesses, who were standing in the February cold of a Tennessee fortification because they had made a decision that the world they came from and the way of life it represented were worth defending with their bodies. This belief was real. It produced real soldiers. What it could not produce at Fort Donelson was real leadership above the regimental level, where the men who held the actual command were not worth what the men under them deserved. The Union soldiers outside the perimeter had spent the same night in the same cold with the same absence of blankets, and their condition was, in some respects, worse than the Confederates inside the fort. They were in the open, without the shelter of the fort's buildings and earthworks, exposed to the February wind on the ridges where their formations had dug in for the siege. The men who had stripped off their overcoats at the beginning of the siege, believing the fighting would warm them, had been making this mistake in wars since antiquity. They paid for it in February nights when the temperature dropped past 20 degrees and the only warmth available was the warmth of the men beside them. They were also, in ways that the soldiers of the Confederacy were not, the soldiers of a nation whose institutional weight was behind them in a way that the Confederacy's institutional weight could not yet match. They came from states with established manufacturing, established railroads, established supply chains. Their muskets were more uniform, their ammunition more consistent, their supply of both more reliable. These were not qualities visible on an individual soldier in a winter field. You could not look at a Union soldier and see his logistical support. But the logistical support was there, in ways that would matter more and more as the war lengthened. Grant spent the night of February 14th visiting the fleet and discussing with Foote the naval situation. He was not in his headquarters when the Confederate breakout attempt began in the morning. He was at the river receiving Foote's assessment, and the word that reached him of the Confederate attack was the word that reached every commander who is away from his position when his line is being hit. Urgent, incomplete, and alarming. He rode back. He rode back at a gallop on a road that the February weather had turned into a demonstration of the specific miseries of winter campaigning. And he arrived at his lines to find the situation worse than the first reports had suggested. The breakout and the counterattack. The Confederate assault on the morning of February 15th began before full daylight, in the particular gray-purple light of a winter morning, when the sun has not cleared the eastern ridgeline, and the shadows are still long, and the temperature is still at its overnight minimum. Pillow's division attacked McClernand's right first. The sound reached the rest of the Union line before the shape of what was happening could be understood. The specific rolling crash of massed musket fire opening in the pre-dawn cold, carrying through the winter air with the crystalline clarity that cold produces in sound, so that soldiers on the Union left and center heard the engagement a full minute before they saw any movement in their front and stood at their positions with their muskets and their cold hands and waited to be told what the sound meant. It meant that 12,000 Confederate soldiers were trying to escape. Pillow's men hit McClernand's division on the Union right with the momentum of men who had been called and penned up for 3 days and who were now, at last, moving. The Confederate attack was not subtle. It was mass, weight, and the particular aggression of soldiers who understand that they are fighting not just to take a position, but to tear a hole through a line and run through it before the hole closes. McClernand's men received them with rifle fire from the ridges and the ravines, but the Confederate pressure was enormous, and it was continuous, and it was coming from multiple directions simultaneously as Pillow spread his attack to maximize the front the Union right had to defend. McClernand's right began to give. By mid-morning, the Confederate assault had opened a significant gap in the Union right. The Forge Road, the escape route the Confederate commanders had planned, was becoming accessible. Pillow's men were driving McClernand's forces back along the ridges, capturing artillery, taking prisoners, killing and wounding Union soldiers at a rate that was churning through the regiments that had been holding the right and that were now retreating in the controlled but unmistakable way of men who are being pushed farther and faster than they can stop. But the breakout required the Confederates to pour their forces through the gap and continue moving south, to accept the road to Nashville as the objective and to keep moving toward it, rather than stopping to consolidate the position they had taken. This is where the Confederate command structure produced its catastrophic failure. Pillow stopped. He stopped for reasons that the historical record has not fully illuminated. The explanations he gave afterward were the explanations of a man constructing a justification rather than describing a decision. The most charitable interpretation is that he stopped to allow his men to resupply their ammunition and to allow the disorganized units to reform before pushing through the gap. The less charitable interpretation, supported by the pattern of his behavior throughout the siege, is that he had achieved what he could see as a tactical success and did not know what to do with it, that the breakout plan had gotten the Confederate forces to the road, and he had no clear plan for what happened next, and that the absence of a next step produced the default response of a man who does not know what to do. He stopped. Floyd concurred in the decision to return. He was not present at the critical moment. He had been managing the overall situation from the fort rather than from the front, and his concurrence was the concurrence of a man being told what had been decided, rather than a man making a decision. Buckner, the professional soldier, did not concur, but could not overrule his superiors. He argued. The argument was brief, professional, and futile. The Confederate forces began moving back toward the fort. What they were abandoning was not simply the ground they had taken. They were abandoning the initiative, the specific military asset that a besieging force does not want the besieged force to hold, the ability to determine where the next engagement occurs and when. The Confederate garrison at Fort Donelson had held the initiative for the morning of February 15th. They had punched through the Union right, had stood on the Forge Road with the route to Nashville accessible, had accomplished the tactical objective of the breakout, and they had given it back, freely, without being forced to give it back, without the Union Army taking it from them. They had returned it as a gift, and Grant was about to open it. Grant arrived at his lines to find the situation changed from what the morning's first reports had described. The Union right was battered and had given ground. The Confederate attack had opened the Forge Road. But the Confederate forces were returning to their lines rather than exploiting the breakthrough. He looked at what was in front of him and made a calculation that took perhaps 30 seconds. He told his staff officers, "The enemy has spent his ammunition." The Confederate attack had lasted all morning and had been intense, thousands of rounds expended in the assault, the men who fought it at their physical and material limit. A force that had spent everything on a breakout attempt and had then been ordered to return to their original positions was a force that had exhausted its offensive capacity. It had not yet exhausted its defensive capacity, but Grant was not going to let it recover. He ordered C.F. Smith on the Union left to attack, immediately, without waiting to reorganize, without waiting for the right to reform, without the systematic preparation that assault doctrine required. Smith was to take the Confederate right with the bayonet, and he was to do it now. The instruction to fix bayonets was specific and tactical rather than ceremonial. The Confederate defenders in the rifle pits on the right had been drawn down by the forces sent to support the morning's breakout. The garrison's strength had been shifted left to enable the pillow attack, leaving the right thinner than it had been when the siege began. An assault with bayonets rather than with fire was an assault that moved faster than a fire and maneuver attack, that hit the objective before its defenders could respond to the warning that incoming fire provided, that gave the defenders no time to concentrate against a threat they could identify from a distance. It was the right instruction for the specific tactical situation. It was also, characteristically of Grant, given in the moment of the opportunity, rather than after the opportunity had been assessed and discussed and planned for. Smith was 60 years old. He had been a soldier for 40 years. He had been superintendent of West Point when Grant was a cadet, and Grant had feared him then with the specific respect that cadets develop for officers whose standards are absolute. Smith was still the same man, upright, ramrod, mustaches that expressed military authority in visible form, possessed of a calm that was not the calm of unfeeling, but the calm of mastery. He received Grant's order, turned to his division, and rode to the front of his leading brigade. He rode ahead of his men. His hat went on his saber point as he crossed the abatis, the felled trees and sharpened stakes of the Confederate outer defense line. He was 60 years old. He was on horseback. He was in front of several thousand men, advancing across broken ground into rifle fire. His division followed him because there is a specific logic in following a man who is doing the thing you are being asked to do and who is ahead of you rather than behind you. They broke through. The Confederate right, its garrison drawn down by the troops sent to reinforce the morning's breakout attempt, received Smith's charge with what it had available: musket fire from the rifle pits, artillery from the gun positions on the ridge, and the specific resistance of soldiers who had been cold and tired for 3 days, and who were now required to hold a position against fresh men with bayonets coming at them fast. The resistance was real. The casualties that Smith's division took in the assault were real. But the Confederate right did not have what it needed to stop the attack. It did not have the density of defenders that a fully manned position would have had, and Smith's charge did not give it time to use what it had effectively. By late afternoon, Smith's division held a significant section of the Confederate outer works. Grant rode to inspect the position, riding through rifle pits that still smelled of the afternoon's fighting, stepping over the specific debris of a defensive position that has been carried by assault. He found Smith. He told him, "If they try to drive you out of these works, you can tell them to go to hell." Smith replied, in the flat voice of a man who says exactly what he means, "I will, General." The night of February 15th fell on a situation that had reversed completely from the morning. The Confederate force that had punched through the Union right and been ordered back had handed Grant his opportunity. Smith's assault had taken the Confederate outer works on the left. The garrison was now compressed into a perimeter significantly smaller than the one it had held at dawn, and the perimeter it held was demonstrably penetrable. Smith's men were inside it. In the fort, the Confederate commanders assembled for a council that was also, though they did not all admit it immediately, a council of despair. Floyd and Pillow discussed the situation and arrived at the conclusion that the fort could not hold another day of what the afternoon had demonstrated. The Union forces were inside the outer works. The garrison's men were exhausted and cold, and their ammunition was depleted from the morning's breakout attempt. The river, which the gunboats controlled even in their damaged state, prevented escape by water. Floyd announced that he was not going to surrender to federal authority. He had been a member of Buchanan's cabinet and feared prosecution for his actions as Secretary of War in the months before secession, when he had allegedly used his position to move arms and military supplies south in anticipation of the war. He was transferring command to Pillow. Pillow announced immediately that he agreed the command should transfer to Buckner. Then Floyd and Pillow escaped. Floyd got a few hundred of his men on steamboats across the river. Pillow crossed the river in a small boat. Nathan Bedford Forrest, commanding the Confederate cavalry, refused to surrender and led his men out through the backwaters of the river, navigating frozen sloughs in the February night in the first demonstration of the operational boldness that would make him the most dangerous cavalry commander of the war. Buckner was left. He sat down and wrote to Grant asking what terms would be accepted for the surrender of the garrison. He and Grant had been friends. He had loaned Grant money. He wrote in the language of two old soldiers addressing each other: formal, correct, professional. Grant's reply was not formal, not correct, and not precisely professional. It was the reply of a man who had been fighting for 3 days in the cold and who had just finished a campaign that had worked exactly the way he had intended it to work, addressed to an enemy commander he respected and to the situation that demanded this specific response and no other. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. Buckner received it. He was angry. He said afterward that the terms were ungenerous and unchivalrous, and he was correct, in the specific sense that the terms violated the conventions of the time, which generally permitted a besieged garrison to negotiate terms of evacuation rather than simply surrendering wholesale. Grant was correct in a different sense. The garrison had no leverage, the position was lost, and the hours it would take to negotiate conventional terms were hours in which men on both sides would continue to die. Buckner surrendered. The morning after. The morning of February 16, 1862, when Buckner's surrender took effect, was the morning that 12,000 Confederate soldiers became Union prisoners of war in the largest surrender of American forces since the Revolution. The number was extraordinary by the standards of a war that was 10 months old. Bull Run in July 1861 had produced Confederate casualties of under 2,000. Ball's Bluff in October had been a Union disaster of approximately 900 casualties. The fighting at Wilson's Creek in Missouri had involved 15,000 men total and produced fewer than 3,000 total casualties. Fort Donelson produced, in 4 days, approximately 13,000 Confederate casualties, 12,000 prisoners, and perhaps 1,000 killed and wounded, against Union casualties of roughly 3,000 in a force of 17,000. The prisoners were processed at the fort through the specific administrative machinery that an army develops for handling bodies in quantity, the recording of names and units, the separation of officers from enlisted, the arrangements for guards, and for the supply of food and water to men who had been rationed since before the siege began. Buckner himself was treated well. Grant came to him that morning with the courtesy that the formal relationship between the two men, the old friendship, and the specific professional respect required. Grant reportedly offered Buckner his purse and told him that whatever money was in it was available to Buckner's personal use. Buckner declined. The gesture was characteristic of Grant in a way that the unconditional surrender note was also characteristic. Both of them were honest, direct expressions of what Grant actually thought and felt, without performance in either direction. The battlefield in the days after the surrender was the battlefield of a winter engagement after the fighting has ended, and it had a specific quality that battlefields in winter always have: the evidence of what happened, preserved by the cold in a way that warmer weather would have addressed more quickly. The dead lay where they had fallen, in positions that the cold had fixed, the specific postures of men who had been caught by bullets in the act of advancing or retreating or simply standing. The equipment abandoned in the breakout attempt and the assault, cartridge boxes emptied and dropped, muskets whose owners would not carry them further, the personal effects that men discard when they are running, lay across the ridges and in the ravines where the fighting had been. The fort itself, inside its earthwork walls, showed the specific damage of a position that had been under artillery fire for 3 days. Gun emplacements disrupted, communication trenches caved in by shells, the wooden structures of the interior reduced to splinters in the sections that had taken direct hits. The Cumberland River flowed below the bluff, darker and faster than it had been in the early days of the siege when the weather had been milder. The Confederate water battery that had damaged Foote's gunboats stood on the bluff above it, its guns still trained downstream, the men who had operated them now prisoners or escaped or dead. Grant wrote to Halleck, "We have taken Fort Donelson, and from 12,000 to 15,000 prisoners, including Generals Floyd, Buckner, Tillman, and others." The writing was spare, factual, and characteristic. He did not celebrate. He did not claim credit in the language that the period's political generals used to claim credit in their reports. He reported the facts and moved on to the next set of facts, which were the logistical requirements of processing the prisoners and the strategic implications of the river corridor now open to the south. Halleck, receiving this dispatch, responded in the way that Halleck responded to successful subordinates. He began immediately maneuvering to appropriate as much of the credit as possible for departmental headquarters and as little as possible for the general in the field. This pattern would continue throughout Grant's time in the Western Theater and would produce the celebrated incident in March when Halleck essentially removed Grant from command on the basis of confused intelligence and then restored him when the confusion was identified, having in the interim kept the most successful Union general in the West sitting idle for 3 weeks. But in mid-February 1862, the response of the Northern public and the Northern press to the news from Fort Donelson was not filtered through Halleck's administrative jealousies. It was simple. Fort Donelson had fallen. 12,000 prisoners. Unconditional surrender grant. What Donelson made. Fort Donelson did not win the Civil War. No single battle does. But it did 3 specific things that made the Union's eventual victory more likely, and understanding those 3 things is understanding what the battle meant. It opened the rivers. The Tennessee River running into northern Alabama, the Cumberland River running to Nashville. These were not simply geographical facts, they were logistical realities, the infrastructure through which the Union could move the enormous weight of material that a modern industrial army required: ammunition, food, clothing, medical supplies, artillery, animals. The Confederate defensive line in Kentucky that Albert Sidney Johnston had spent months building was now untenable. He retreated south, abandoning Bowling Green and Columbus and Nashville, the first Confederate state capital to fall to Union forces. The entire Confederate strategic position in the Western Theater collapsed within 2 weeks of Donelson's fall, and the collapse was directly attributable to the loss of the river fortresses. It established Grant. This is the second thing, and in retrospect, it may be the most consequential. The Union, in early 1862, had no shortage of generals. It had an abundance of generals, many of them politically well-connected, personally ambitious, and militarily timid. McClellan in the East was organizing an army of 100,000 men with a care and a thoroughness that would eventually produce the Peninsula Campaign and the 7 Days, and the specific pattern of advancing to within striking distance of Richmond and then stopping. Buell in the West was careful and deliberate and slow. Halleck was brilliant at administration and paralyzed at the moment of decision. The Union Army needed something it did not have in abundance: a commander who would attack when the opportunity was there, who would not ask for terms, who would move immediately upon the enemy's works and not stop moving until the works had fallen. Fort Donelson demonstrated that Grant was that commander. It demonstrated it in a specific, observable, undeniable way. Not through his own account of the battle, but through the 12,000 prisoners and the open rivers and the Confederate strategic collapse that followed. Lincoln noticed. Lincoln had been struggling with the question of military command since the war began, had been cycling through general after general in the search for the officer who would fight, who would use the Union's enormous material advantage rather than cultivating it and hoarding it and advancing it cautiously toward battles that might not go well. Fort Donelson gave him a data point about Grant that he would not forget. The third thing that Donelson did was less immediately visible, but equally important. It established the specific character of the war in the Western theater. The Confederate command failures at Donelson, Floyd's abandonment of the garrison, Pillow's equally shameful escape, the confusion and the panic that produced the surrender of a force that had punched through the Union right that morning and had, in theory, a viable path to escape, exposed the fundamental weakness of the Confederate military command culture in the West. Albert Sidney Johnston, who was supposed to be the solution to that culture's problems, could not replace the competence he had not had. The Western Confederate Army would spend the next year struggling with a command problem that Fort Donelson had made visible, and that Shiloh, in April 1862, would make catastrophic. Grant, for his part, drew no public lessons from his victory. He wrote no memoirs of Fort Donelson until the very end of his life, when the personal memoirs he dictated in his final months with throat cancer gave him the opportunity to describe the campaign with the same spare precision that had characterized his dispatches at the time. His account of Fort Donelson in the memoirs is the account of a man who had worked out what he was doing and done it, and could describe it in retrospect with the clarity of someone who understood exactly which decisions had mattered. The decision to trust C.F. Smith, the decision to attack immediately when the Confederate breakout attempt failed, the decision to move immediately upon the enemy's works. What Fort Donelson established, in February 1862, was not simply that Grant could win a battle. It established the specific mechanism by which Grant won battles. He identified what the situation required, he gave the order that the situation required, and he did not revisit the order while the situation was still unfolding. The specific mechanism was not complicated, it was not subtle. It was simply rare, in the Union Army of 1862, to the point of being unique. Lincoln said of him, when the rumors about Grant's drinking reached the White House, and when the political generals who felt threatened by Grant's success pressed Lincoln to remove him, "I can't spare this man, he fights." This statement has been quoted so frequently that its specific meaning sometimes blurs in the repetition. What Lincoln meant was not simply that Grant was brave. The Union Army had numerous brave generals who were nevertheless not winning the war. What Lincoln meant was that Grant had the quality that Lincoln had been searching for since the war began and had not found in abundance: the willingness to use the army as an instrument of destruction rather than an instrument of performance, to fight for the purpose of killing and capturing the enemy rather than fighting for the purpose of demonstrating that fighting was occurring. The distinction is real, and it determined the course of the war. Grant fought at Shiloh in April 1862, where he was nearly destroyed on the first day by an attack that he had not adequately anticipated, and where he held through the night when other commanders were counseling retreat, and where he counterattacked on the second day and drove the Confederate army from the field. Shiloh was bloody and controversial and produced the calls for his removal that Lincoln refused, but it demonstrated that Fort Donelson was not an anomaly, that the quality of not retreating, of attacking when the situation seemed to demand defense, was consistent in Grant in the way that character is consistent, rather than the way that luck is consistent. Grant fought at Vicksburg in 1863 in a campaign of such operational sophistication that historians of the Civil War consistently rank it among the finest sustained military operations in American history. A campaign in which Grant marched his army across a peninsula, crossed the Mississippi below the Confederate fortress, cut loose from his supply line, and lived off the land for 2 weeks while fighting 5 separate engagements, and then besieged the fortress from the land side until the 47-day siege produced its surrender on July 4th, the same day that Meade repulsed Lee at Gettysburg in the east. With Vicksburg, the Mississippi River was open from source to mouth. The Confederacy was cut in half. Lincoln brought him east in 1864 and gave him command of all Union armies with the specific mandate that had been the missing element in the East. Fight. Keep fighting. Do not let Lee recover between engagements. Accept the casualties that continuous offensive pressure produces and keep moving. Because the Union could absorb those casualties and the Confederacy could not. Grant did exactly this in the Overland Campaign of 1864, the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, the Siege of Petersburg, a campaign of ferocious cost and unceasing forward motion that ground down the Army of Northern Virginia until the spring of 1865, when Lee could no longer hold his lines and the end came quickly at Appomattox. All of that was the consequence of Fort Donelson. Not in the simple causal sense. The history of a war is not a chain of inevitabilities, but in the sense that Fort Donelson established what Grant was, what he was capable of, and what the Union Army would have if it used him. Lincoln used him. The war ended. Centuries later, Fort Donelson is a national military park in Dover, Tennessee, on the bluff above the Cumberland River. The earthwork fortifications have been preserved and partially restored. The river battery, where the Confederate guns repulsed Foote's gunboats, still overlooks the Cumberland. The outer trenches where Smith's division broke through are still visible as low ridges in the winter bare ground. The cemetery holds the Union dead. The note that Grant sent to Buckner on the morning of February 16th is preserved in the historical record in multiple copies, in multiple archives, in the specific way that documents which define a moment get preserved by everyone who was present. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. The man who wrote it would go on to Shiloh and Vicksburg and the Overland Campaign and the Siege of Petersburg and the final pursuit to Appomattox. He would go on to the presidency and the specific successes and failures of 8 years in a political environment far more complicated than any military campaign. He would go on to financial ruin and cancer and the final act of writing his memoirs in a race against his own death to secure his family's financial future, dictating at a rate that produced the finest military memoir in the English language in the months before the cancer finished him. All of that was ahead in February 1862. What was present was a frozen river, a captured fort, 12,000 prisoners, and a man who had been told his entire career that he was mediocre, standing in the morning cold and knowing, without visible emotion, that he was not. The fort had fallen. The rivers were open. The war in the West had a commander. And the man who had been working in a leather goods store in Galena, Illinois, 18 months before, the man no one wanted, the man who had failed at everything else, had just proved in the February cold of Tennessee that he was the man the war required.